And Julie, if you want somebody, do you want anybody else to help out with letting people in the rooms?
No, I got it.
Okay, okay, cool. So welcome everybody. My name is Kimberly Bautista on behalf of Justice for My Sister Collective. We're really happy to be partnering with Sundance Film Festival on this panel discussion. Honored to share this space with Michèle Stephenson, who is joining us from New York, and with Alexis Gambis, who's here from Spain. Two really incredible filmmakers, prolific, just such remarkable work. And I want to thank you both for taking the time to be really intentional with centering really crucial stories and coming from a place of deep compassion and a beautiful dialect of ethics with the work that you do. And so I just want to welcome the both of you, welcome everybody who's joining us, and just set an intention and invite everybody to get grounded by just being aware of the land that you're on, the land that you're inhabiting currently, honoring the ancestral lands that you represent from both your paternal and maternal side. And I want to just acknowledge that currently I'm on Tongva land here in Southern California, and invite each and every one of you to get connected to the land wherever you're situated. We're here connected through this virtual realm, and yet we have all of these resources in within reach just to get grounded. If we get triggered, you know, you're invited to turn off your camera. If you need to step away from the computer, that's not a problem at all. You know, just take care of yourselves, whatever it is that comes up for you. We want you to honor that and be present with where you're at, with the land, with the water, with your ancestors, and just honor what your needs are today. So with that being said, I want to just really start out by naming the ways that colonization has historically disconnected us from our own humanity. Colonization has disconnected us from our ability to communicate with each other, to deepen our relationships with each other, to deepen our intimacy with ourselves, with our higher power, and with each other. And I'm just so grateful to be in conversation with these incredible artists today to talk about the ways that they are course correcting that trend of colonization, to ground our communities in our own humanity through reflecting and reclaiming the frame, to reflecting and reclaiming our narratives. And also like this, I find that like the common current between both of your work is like addressing, like entering into different ways of kind of like disrupting that trajectory and that legacy of colonization through just like in Alexis' case, like examining the ways that humanity is also connected to the animal world, right? And how that's inherently mystical, that's inherently spiritual. And then in Michèle's case, right, like re-establishing these conversations, re-establishing these memories, and then reimagining how we can reclaim public space to rectify and to create like racial justice. So with that being said, I just want to hear from both of you on, you know, how your art is a means to create that medicine, and in reclaiming our own humanity, how this is creating a space for ancestral healing, both for the people who are telling their stories in your films, and also for yourselves as artists. So Michèle, do you want to maybe share? You're muted right now.
Yeah, I was saying that's a big question. I feel like there's been an evolution of, you know, as I think with any artist, an evolution in the work and my focus. And I feel like I started out very much in analyzing the here and the now, and the processing of how things were happening, either to me from a racial justice lens, or to my family with the observational, personal film that we did called American Promise, which was this 13-year observational self-reflective film looking at our son's educational trajectory. And from there, I feel like I've evolved from the here and now to connecting the past with the here and now. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that it's almost sort of this unconscious pull that has happened and is now reflected in almost all of the work that I'm doing in one way or another. And I think it comes to a place that's very personal, because I make art, or I think it's Joan Didion who said, we tell stories in order to live, right? It's part of a healing process that's very personal to me. And that I've gravitated towards storytelling because of its, its ancestral significance, because we've always told stories. All communities tell stories to keep not just our archive and our the story of our communities, but also as a way, I think, for us to heal as well. And so with the latest projects I've been involved in, it's really thinking about the racial caste system, thinking about white supremacy, and looking at its very personal impact from reclaiming what our ancestors have already laid down. Whether it's a more recent film I've done called Stateless, which takes place in the Dominican Republic. I'm of Haitian ancestry, and I was born in Haiti, where actually that island is very interesting in its own right, in terms it's the first place where the Europeans landed. It's the first place where Africans landed. It's the first place where genocide against indigenous peoples happened. It's also the birthplace of our racial caste system across the Americas. And so I took the journey back there on the one hand to reclaim a history of genocide, a recent genocide that took place in 1937 by the dictator Trujillo against Dominicans of Haitian descent, against the Haitian migrants. And it's all woven into a contemporary story where I think I collaborate with participants who somehow embody that past in the work they're doing right now. And I think Lamar, that you've mentioned in the more recent film that I've done, and who is sort of kind of represented also in the VR project that's currently at Sundance, embodies the past and the present, and has this energy source that is about sort of reclaiming, memorializing places so we can better understand our present and future. And this is the space that I have been inhabiting. And I think for me, it's about the intergenerational trauma that I have actually lived through because of a racial caste system that's a result of colonialism and slavery, and processing it through story so I can heal. And somehow the personal healing, which is very specific and draws us to a specific place, has a larger resonance because, we have all sort of been affected by it. And so I guess that's my journey from where I start. It starts from a personal place of healing and being attracted to stories where I will be sort of messing with sort of my own discomforts, but sort of try to understand and excavate personally, symbolically, but also excavate what we have not been told, what we have not been told.
And the not having been told, like that part of it, I think the systematic, like, olvido, like the way that we forget, the way that we're systematically indoctrinated to forget, that's how colonization continues, right? That's how these caste systems continue to perpetuate themselves. And Alexis, in your film, there is this theme of forgetfulness, or like the memories that kind of haunt us, that were either like a byproduct of our relationships with our relatives, or that we somehow internalized and we don't know how to make sense of. And so I just find that like so powerful. So if you could speak a little bit on that theme and kind of how your own experience with that in your own life has informed that.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I think to add to what Michèle was saying, I think a lot of my approach comes from, you know, especially the approach in terms of decolonizing. I think a lot of my approach is in observation and kind of the empirical, you know, because a lot of my kind of background has been as a scientist. And so a lot of my work has been kind of this introspection in terms of trying to understand and trying to also decipher patterns, and also, you know, as you were mentioning, kind of looking or turning to animals as you know, not only kind of sources of inspiration, but also as role models. You know, in the sciences, we often refer to the animals we study as model organisms, you know, which is always an interesting term, like this model organism. Which means basically that we use animals as a way to understand the human condition, right? And so my way of tackling a lot of these issues about, you know, about race and colonialization is to really to turn to the animal and just observe, you know, how the animal behaves, you know, why they behave in a certain way. And I'm very interested also in, you know, back to this idea of ancestral healing. I'm very interested in how, you know, ancestral and traditional movements have been very, very connected to science. You know, there's this amazing book by Jeremy Narby. It's called The Cosmic Serpent, and it's about how, you know, different shamans and curanderos see this recurring cosmic. The book is called Cosmic Serpent, and it's basically they see this recurring image of a intertwined serpent, which is actually, you know, DNA basically. And so the idea is that, you know, shamans and curanderos discovered DNA before scientists did. And so I think there's a lot to be said about kind of, you know, turning to animals and also turning to kind of spirituality as a way of understanding our world. And so, in my case, my film is ultimately about monarch butterflies, right? And the butterfly has been recently, especially recently with a lot of the racial divide that's been happening and all these discussions about the border, there's been a lot of associations to immigration and the butterfly being used as a symbol for migrant rights, the butterfly being able to migrate freely. There's this beautiful story about, which I mentioned in the film, which I'll just say here, which is the butterflies migrate from Canada through the US and arrive in Mexico. And they observed that when the butterflies were crossing from Canada through the US, when they were around Lake Erie, they made like a circle around the lake. And nobody understood why they didn't just go straight south. Why did they kind of circle around the lake? And the idea is, you know, one of the theories, and again, this is part science, part fiction, is that there used to be a mountain millions of years ago. And the butterflies still think that the mountain is there. And so then this led us to believe that maybe by studying animals and by studying butterflies, we can understand the worlds, you know, the ancestral world. We can understand what used to be in this world before humans, or even before any type of civilization has been. So, and this is kind of mentioned in the film. So that's sort of my way of tackling these things. I'm very much of a scientist in the sense that I like observing and then kind of assessing based on observation. And I love also connecting the infinitely small to the, you know, kind of the macro and macro worlds. And so, yeah, I don't know if I fully answered the question, but this is kind of the approach and how I tackle these issues is through these processes of observation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think story is just so fundamental to our process of understanding ourselves, understanding how to make sense of trauma and how to make sense of, you know, how to even kind of process that trauma in order to integrate all facets of our experience, because often what trauma does is it creates this tendency to compartmentalizing our experiences. And so I find that the integration process is really where the healing exists. And so being able to kind of both own that experience, but also not define ourselves by that trauma, or how to also transcend it, how to also create new spaces to also look towards, you know, how we can create joy in our lives, create liberation for ourselves on a daily basis. And so Michèle, I know in your short with Lamar, he talks about the ways that that Allie Mae Neal Smith kind of had to, and his own relatives had to kind of create that space of honoring the trauma that existed of that lynching, that very public spectacle like lynching in their community, and then also create a means to kind of create, sort of build their lives, right, and have children and create joy in their lives. And so I'm just really interested with this way of how to hold all of these experiences and what that means in the healing process, and then also connecting that to just what that means for our ancestors who often might not have been able to bridge that sort of transcending the compartmentalization of the trauma.
Well, I think there are multiple things there. I can, you know, I think first we have to acknowledge that we have lived through terror, right? That terror is happening now. I mean, I can just very physically feel a difference after the inauguration in my own body, you know, just as a recent thing. I'm talking about processing and feeling what terror can do. And so if you take a place like Mariana, I could talk a little bit about what we try to do in the VR space that is more than just that story. It's about our 400 years of history of slavery and colonization. So our reaction, and I can even speak, you know, personally in terms of just even within my family, is not just to compartmentalize, but to hide, right? To not acknowledge, to avoid. This is both for those of us who come from marginalized communities, as well as those who commit the terror, right? It's the mode of survival, because you've got to make that day. So maybe you can try to have some of these joyous moments, and you try to create a way that you can live in a path where the terror is minimized. And part of it means crushing that and, you know, not seeing it. So someone like Lamar did not know about this lynching, although the daughter of the man who was lynched was his mother's very good friend. They had never spoken about it. He found out about it in a library, right? When he was looking for a book and saw the connection of the last name, and then went home and then asked, why didn't anybody ever tell me, you know? And so what we try to do with and then I know I have very specific instances of that type of trauma that's hidden within my family, you know, on a number of different levels that are about choice. Shame is another big thing too. The idea of shame and how that's internalized and how white supremacy uses that is really big. And so for me, I realize in the work that I do is trying to also kind of lift that shame out of the way so we can reclaim. And in the VR project, what we've done is made connections of actual moments, whether it's in the 1800s, in a slave warehouse, or in a jail, you know, in a jail in contemporary New Jersey, or, you know, in Mariana. And we repeat some of the dialogue so you see a collapse of time, and you see that what's happened yesterday is also happening today. And it's this cycle. And it's a cycle that we need to discuss, we need to confront, but that we also need to sort of acknowledge and memorialize so we can move forward. So what was your question? What was your question? I think you answered it.
Yeah, yeah, you totally,
Okay.
you totally answered it. I mean,
the idea of hiding, right? Yes,
yeah.
yes. And you know, yeah, it's and yeah, so trauma, and I think it's also what makes us become artists. Some of us who certainly take the risk of wanting to just open it all up for risk, and you know, to confront things. You know, I think my mother sort of still doesn't know exactly what I do, but she also knows that I speak about things, and she's still sort of like, oh, you know, why would you say that? And we enter into these conversations that are really important, and I think we both evolved out of it. So,
but definitely that connection between the compartmentalization and the silencing and the shaming and the trying to imagine away these narratives as a way to get to the joy. And so now I think that the art is the place where we're able to really find the integration, where we're able to kind of hold both the past and the future and the present, right? And so Alexis, if you could speak a little on the ways that your character kind of is able to integrate his own experience with trauma. And I'm just really curious of how this thread kind of became part of your work.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately my film has a lot to do with kind of an internal process that he's going through. So it's not easy to make a film about that because there's no clear antagonist. You know, it's a lot of the, you know, my film Son of Monarchs is kind of this journey into his, you know, trauma, but also the trauma gets blurred with him kind of going through an existential crisis. The trauma transforms into different iterations in the film. So what initially may be trauma at some point also becomes kind of this search for identity and who he is. And as you mentioned, he has to kind of break it apart. He has to deconstruct it. He has to understand it as like separate components to be able to then rebuild and reassemble. And so the trick in the film was to kind of find ways in which I could visualize or sonically bring those elements to the audience so that they understand that he was going through this process. Because a lot of the film, you know, is just observing him. You know, it's almost like a character study of observing this man who is trying to understand his roots, trying to understand early trauma that happened to him when he was a child, also trying to figure out, literally, you know, dissecting animals to try to understand himself. I mean, that's like literally what he does in a laboratory context. So I think that's sort of how I address this issue of trauma. I think trauma is a really interesting word because again, going back to animals, the only way we can really observe trauma in animals is if they actually exhibit something external, right? Which is very interesting because with animals, we can never fully understand what animals feel or you know, the pain that they go through. We can only understand that if they actually have like an exterior aspect to it. And that's when we can empathize. So that's why, you know, we may not understand the pain that a tree goes through or a plant, but they obviously go through pain, but it's not something that we can actually see, and therefore we don't harness it. So I think it's really interesting to think of trauma as things that appear at the surface, but there's also a lot of trauma that we don't see, you know, and so that becomes really interesting on how you can explore that world. And so, you know, there's a really beautiful poet, his name is Manuel Castillo, that he has this line about butterflies. He says, perhaps the butterflies are mute because their stories would be too terrible to share. And so it's just a beautiful line because it's about, you know, imagine all of the kind of the horror that these animals see when they cross the borders, and obviously they can't speak for it. And so I think it's really interesting. This film ultimately was really a challenge to figure out ways in which I could actually exhibit that trauma, and also have him reflected in his own dreams and and whenever I go into these worlds of magical realism, or it's always motivated by the character. It's never something external. It's never something that I impose in making the film. It's always motivated by where he is in that specific moment. And I think that's really important. As Michèle was saying, as artists, we need to make sure that we don't kind of impose our own viewing on the trauma that these characters are going through. And I think they need to exhibit it in their own way. And we we're almost like the enablers. We help them as artists and scientists, and we help them bring that, almost like therapists, we help them bring it to the surface, but we're not the ones that actually spark it. And in my film also, the ritual is what sparks, what brings the trauma back to the surface, which is sort of the beginning of my film. Is what happens is that a ritual is what kind of helps him re-engage with his own trauma. So
there's one thing I just want to add, because I don't want to, so trauma, it happens, but it also doesn't necessarily define us. And I think that also what our ancestors and our the centuries of looking back and seeing, we also find ways of not just coping, but thriving and overcoming and joy. That it's a mixed bag,
yeah.
as humans, Yeah. So the trauma, it's part of who we are. In some cases, it drives our artistry. It drives us to do things and create things that are really sort of magical in many ways as part of the processing. So I just want to make sure that we see that part of it too, that it's not all sort of this oppressive. Yes, there is this oppressive element, but out of that also, because our human condition, unconsciously, we find ways of finding beauty, of finding moments of joy, of creating, whether it's, and of moments, as you said earlier, of intimacy with our, with our loved ones. So I don't want to lose that.
Yeah, I think trauma, I think it's interesting because it can be very, it can be a catalysis, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be also negative. And I think that, in science, we often talk about, there's this whole field called epigenetics. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. It means basically that the way in which our ancestors and our parents have behaved can have effects on us, and these can be inherited. And we can, of course, undo these things, but definitely there's a passing of these things. And I definitely think that it can be very constructive, and it can be very empowering if we're able to harness what these feelings are. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in looking deeper into how both of you are using cinematography to kind of build an inner landscape so that we understand a little bit of more of what's going on with each character. And so just the way that what in terms of the creative process, how do you go through your own understanding of the feel of your and the experience of your art? How do you hone in on, okay, we're telling the story of expansiveness and from this place of integrating these experiences of trauma and of joy, and being able to hold space for this journey of these characters, then understand from there what the actual visual is going to be, what the actual soundscape is. I'm just really, because I feel like both of you have this really beautiful way of unfolding the story through the visual and the auditory world, and shaping that world from the character. And so I'm just really curious to hear you both speak on how you shape that, starting with the character and then building out their inner world through your craft as storytellers.
Alexis, you want to go first? I've been going first every time.
Sure. I think a lot of these decisions about the visuals, and definitely sound is a very big part of my work. I'm actually in some ways more connected to sound than I am to visuals, but a lot of it is based on the kind of the participation of the subject. I do a lot of documentary work in terms of understanding, specific, them retelling their stories, or witnessing, for example, like a dance that would happen in like one of these villages in Mexico where kids would dress up as butterflies. So a lot of my imagery comes from me understanding what's happening in these different environments. Then of course I have my own way of taking that and in a way, harnessing it and reenacting it. But I would say that, again, coming back to what I had said earlier, I think many of those choices come as it's a conversation that I have with the actors and with other people on the crew, of course, the cinematographer and the sound designer. And I think that I'm very interested in kind of incorporating my magical realism in either in dream states, but also in moments where there's like moments of introspection. That's when I come in as an artist, and I can say like, well, maybe I can take a little bit of ownership over this dream, because it's a moment where like it's basically this imagined world. And so I propose to the actors, what if we did a dream where you were covered with butterflies, or what if we had a moment where you touched the window and it became a butterfly wing? And so it's a discussion with the actor and with a cinematographer, and we kind of come up with these ideas. But I'm very aware of the fact that I don't want it to be over saturated. So I'm very kind of keen on it being like punctuations, like very, very sparse moments in the film, where the film is very grounded in reality, but there are moments where we kind of enter into these worlds. In terms of the cinematography of my film, I was also really interested in the camera being a butterfly. So having a kind of its own mind, its own anima, in the story, meaning that the butterfly would sometimes approach the actor, but then it would sometimes move away from the actor. And so it had a life of its own. And so that was one of the big things is to have these kind of witnesses, and I'm very interested in animals observing humans, something that I do a lot in my films, where I suddenly get into the animal observing the human, because I find it interesting and changing the roles and how we think about these things. And in terms of sound, I'm very interested in, and like, for example, when I'm in the macro world and the microscope world, I'm very interested in emphasizing all of the sounds, and creating this like soundscape of scissors cutting through a larva, or just hearing kind of the water gushing through. And so, very kind of a sensorial experience. Like Harvard has this group called the Sensory Ethnographic Lab, which is all about like heightened senses. And so I'm very interested. And there's this beautiful film called Leviathan, where it's all like, it's almost like it's overstimulated senses, and I'm really interested in that, in exploring that, especially when I do these macro worlds. So yeah, that's a little bit about my approach. But
I noticed you also use the elements a lot: fire, water,
yeah,
and
so
even through the sound. Yeah.
The film mixes fire, water, wind, and also when I was speaking to my sound designer, I said, every time you create a scene, before we even add music, I want to make sure that you have a cocktail of all of these elements together. And so the water becomes fire. And of course, in the film, he has a phobia of water. And then, of course, he wants to be a butterfly, which is flight, which is wind. So definitely that plays a lot in the soundscape. And I tend not to have a lot of music in my films. It's very sparse as well. And but playing with the elements is a big part of it.
Yeah, I think, well, in the case of the Changing Saying, the short film, I really sort of like, we just take the time. The film in a way is visually also an ode. It's also memorializing. It's its own memorial to the past and the events that took place there. And so how do we interpret that visually? It's really being and getting a sense of place and location, both sound-wise and visually, but visually in a way that, you know, that in some ways also attractive. There's sort of this tension when you're in the space of beauty, but you also, in the words that you're hearing, understand that horrific things happened in that space, but that there's somehow this beauty here still. And I think that for us, it was really important that those two be held at the same time, that dichotomy. And you know, imagery is symbolic, right? Symbolic in many ways. So the trees were hugely important, you know, in symbolic ways. But it was important for us, for you, when you see it, to feel like you are in that space, you are hearing what's being heard there, and that there is a beauty here that hides other things beneath it. So that was our intention in terms of how we approached that. And interestingly enough, for the VR project, which is Depth Kit 3D captured, it's not a 360 video, we did photogrammetry captures of the space in Mariana, Florida, of those same trees that you see, and of the river, and of these spaces, and of the shacks that we kind of then brought into the VR space. So there is a sense of beauty, but also a sense of groundedness in what you're seeing as well, that it's not all computer generated, that there is a sense of rootedness in the imagery. So I think in all, and each film is actually different in terms of how we approach it, because it has to do with theme, with what symbolisms, what subtext are we trying to evoke, in conversation with the participants who are you know, collaborating with us. But in this particular case, you know, the film itself and the images also serve as a memorial to the events that are being commemorated.
Yeah, and you know, something that also is really striking to me is this concept of not having an antagonist, right? And so Alexis, you spoke to this. I feel like that's really important and crucial to this conversation, because when we talk about ancestral healing, we're also talking about the ways that we are reclaiming ancestral storytelling, and the ways that we, through the work, are able to kind of push back against certain archetypes and certain modes of kind of the hero's journey that's very much a process of colonization and part of the legacy of colonization, right? And so I'd like to talk a little bit about form and of these stories, and kind of just how in the actual structure of the story, it's so unique to each of these characters' journeys. And so how we could kind of see that as a means of also decolonizing, right? Just the actual structure of the story itself. Alexis, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think there's a tendency, like one of the tropes, one of the bad habits in cinema is this tendency of wanting to have an antagonist, right? And it becomes part of this, you know, it almost becomes like an oddity when you don't have an antagonist. And I think that definitely going against the grain of that idea and figuring out ways in which you can actually structure a film without an antagonist is a pretty remarkable experiment. And I think that that's one of the things that I was trying to do, and also criticized for, you know, people saying like, oh, but who's the antagonist? Is it his brother? Is it the trauma itself that's the antagonist? And so everybody was trying to claim what that, you know, personify what that antagonist was. The way in which I structured the film was I was really interested in this idea of development, right? That his character would go through different stages of development as a butterfly would go through, you know, so like a larval caterpillar stage, a cocoon, and then this idea that the cocoon actually explodes, and, you know, the idea of metamorphosis. And so at each one of those stages, I had specific ways in which I wanted to visualize the tension, the tug of war that he was having, the internal conflicts that he was having, and what exactly would come up to the surface for the viewer, right? So every stage of development almost has like a different way. The film is almost like a melting pot of different techniques and different, you know, like towards the end of the film, there's a bit more of a science fiction quality to the film that is not in the beginning. And it's because I try to stamp these different stages with different colors and different ways in which I wanted to kind of visualize and experience the film. And so that was my way of dealing with this idea of conflict and antagonism and kind of an interior balance that he was going through. Yeah, so that's a little bit in terms of the structure that I went through in dealing with these issues. But yeah, I think it's really important to change those perceptions, you know, and especially to change those ideas of needing to have an external identity that we can despise and contest and a villain. I think it's really important to have stories that don't have that. So.
Agreed. I think well, I'm playing a lot more these days with nonlinear sort of storytelling, but I think even before that, if we're talking about sort of thinking about how do we engage in a practice around decolonizing what's been, you know, sort of imposed or we've internalized, is in the practice itself. Is for me, you know, what is extremely important is how am I engaging in my practice of creation, right? How am I engaging and collaborating with those around me? What am I perpetuating in those relationships, and what am I trying to shift in those relationships? You know, a documentary film is inherently extractive. It started as an extractive process, you know, from Nanook of the North with creating these myths, these propaganda through these extractions for a specific, you know, white audience. And so, so how do we in this nonfiction storytelling space not just inform, challenge that, but in the practice challenge it? And, you know, there are different ways of engaging in that through a more participatory perspective, thinking about who we hire when we do hire, how to engage with participants. And so I try to be very intentional about that. And of course, it's not always successful, but I think the first thing is about being aware of it. And for me, I've created, you know, long-term friendships with a lot of the participants that I've worked with. Because, you know, in challenging that, you're taking, yeah, there's a different relationship also that kind of emerges, I think, out of that engagement and spending so much time with folks. So, and building the trust, taking the time to build the trust.
Thank you for speaking on that, Michèle. I also find that, you know, if my intention with storytelling is to create healing and to create intergenerational healing for myself and for my lineage and 7 generations back and 7 generations forward, then I have to learn to be really present with myself in the creation process. And that is really tricky in an industry that is so focused on production and productivity. Oftentimes to the detriment of our well-being, with 12-hour production days, 12, 14, 16-hour production days, right? But also just with the expectations of turnaround. And so I found that even in my writing process, my own internalized sort of expectation for perfection, or, you know, this tendency to lean on shame, which, as you mentioned, Michèle, is a byproduct of colonization, right? And using shame to judge and critique myself in my own writing process. It's not if you're doing that as a writer, it's really not a safe way to create. You know, it's really, you can't, because your body literally will contract and you can't receive any longer. So a lot of my process currently is just learning how to soften, learning how to be present in my body, and in a way like get out of my head, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but how do I re-inhabit my body, right? And as a trauma survivor, that is a process in and of itself too, because, right, we as trauma survivors do tend to kind of either daydream or, you know, whatever, get into our head, or, you know, kind of just, you know, yeah, I think that can be a coping mechanism. So for me, learning how to just really invite presence into my art practice has been transformative. And it's something that has taken me a really long time. And it's interesting because we call it a discipline, but it really requires a different kind of quality that maybe is not discipline. It's more about diligence, you know? So I'm just curious if we could continue speaking a little bit about, you know, the ways that not only we can create healing for ourselves and for the people that we're working with, our collaborators, but even just as an internal process, how our art can be kind of a safe place for us to create. Alexis, do you want to share?
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to this idea of investment, right? That when you're embarking on these projects, it's not about necessarily like a product, right? It's not like this product-driven enterprise, but there's a sense that everybody's invested in it for reasons that are beyond, you know, whether it's an interactive media piece, or whether it's a film, whether it's, I think it's important to understand that it's almost larger than you. So oftentimes because, you know, humans have a tendency of coming back to these kind of, you know, moments of pettiness and quarrels and on set, and also being aware of time. And I think I always kind of bring it back to like why, you know, as you were saying, that we're here, we're connected, and also this is something that is bigger than us, right? And always, what I also tend to do is also be very open to ideas, you know, to other people informing the project, and being able to obviously make decisions in critical moments, but also being open, having almost this like plasticity to the project at every stage of the way, whether it's before shooting, and of course being aware that there is a certain way in which things are done, and you have to shoot in a number of days. But I'm very much in this kind of spirit of like being in the present moment when I shoot my films, and taking time to do exercises. For example, when we did The Ritual, one of the actors brought together all of the people that lived in the village. Those are the people that actually acted in this ritual scene. All of them were locals. We even had the mayor of this town that was in the scene. And for about 2 hours, we just kind of sat around, you know, a bonfire, and we talked a little bit about, you know, we just shared our thoughts, and then we asked everybody, you know, what animals would you want to become? I mean, this is how, and then at some point we turned on the camera and we started shooting it, but it was really part of the exercise. And I think that those are the ways in which I think it's really important to understand also that it's a collective, you know, it's not an individual pursuit. As much as you're reminded of that, that's how I kind of, I remind everybody, you know, these questions, that we're here together. It's a collective project. And so, yeah, so those are kind of the ways in which I approach my work. And I think of it, you know, oftentimes people say like, oh, you know, how did you go from science to being a filmmaker? And I say, well, actually film is an extension to my research. You know, it's part of how I document, externalize, understand myself, understand, you know, I use the art form to reflect upon it. So it's more than just a product, but it's kind of like an ongoing research procedure for me. So,
Michèle?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to that. I think, I mean, the biggest thing, and we kind of touched on it, is this idea of creating the space. We have to be intentional about creating that space to allow for what you were talking about, Kimberly. And I think about in the documentary work, I spend much more time without the camera on than with it on, right? And it's in those moments where the camera's off, nothing is being recorded, and we are creating connection that allow for, you know, the magic to happen when the camera's on. And I think that we can't shortchange that, and we can't truncate it. I've been in situations where the pressure was, you know, to truncate it, and the result is different, and the stress is different, and the energy it feels extractive. So understanding that being off, and I think it's also just about, you know, the wonderment of wanting to have human connection, that an investment in that process, and there's a pressure to think that maybe, you know, because of how we structure work, you know, that some of this stuff is a waste of time, but everything pays off. The more time we spend, the more we're able to connect. It ends up giving us much better results at the end, and where everybody else is also happier. So, but you have to be intentional about it, because you can get carried away with deliverables and what needs to get done, and you know, the capitalist structure that imposes that on us. So, and it's not always possible, depending on the work. But if you're able to at least be a little intentional about it. Oh, we just lost Julissa. I mean, not Julissa, we just lost Kimberly. Okay.
Yeah, don't panic. I think she will connect with us in a minute. I know she did mention earlier that we were having some connection issues, so just stand by for her to come back.
Michèle, I haven't seen your piece yet, but I'm gonna go watch it after.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit heavy. It requires tethered headset.
Yeah.
With a computer, but yeah, well, I'll be eager to hear what you have to say. When is your piece playing, or is it part of yeah?
Yeah, my piece is in the next program. It's called Son of Monarchs. It's a feature, my second feature that shot between Mexico and New York. So
wow.
Playing now.
There we go.
Any of us see you.
She's back.
That sounds so amazing.
I'm back.
Speaking about being in the present, there we go.
Sorry about that. My internet has been giving me trouble these days. So forgive me. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, what it means for me as somebody who is a product of not only colonization and forced migration, but for somebody who's a product of assimilation, to what does it mean for me to divest from whiteness, right? And what does it mean for me to leverage my own white privilege to create spaces for other creators of color to really elevate and amplify their work. And so I find that, you know, the means that I've been able to do this is by, through my organization, through Justice for My Sister, and hosting workshops and providing tools to folks in my community to tell stories, to tell their own stories. And so, but you know, it's something that I think it's daily work, and it's something that I'm still unraveling. And so, in terms of like understanding really how to leverage that privilege in a way that serves my community. And so, yeah, I just wanted to invite, if either of you wanted to speak on that and kind of your own process or your thoughts on that trajectory that I'm kind of really trying to be mindful and kind of, you know, embarking on in a meaningful way. Yeah, I just thought it would be helpful, definitely for my own process, if either of you would like to speak on that.
Want to go, Michèle? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I could go. I mean, that's a big question. I mean, it's part of part of the work, as you said, is also internal. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, but my self-awareness about my privilege as a light-skinned woman of Latinx and African ancestry in these different spaces. How do I navigate that in that self-awareness and allow for space, as well as understanding that there's a certain narratives that I'm a part of too that need to be expressed. It's a daily thing. It's a daily self-awareness of the privilege that exists, and it's sometimes I will challenge myself and be in a place of discomfort so that I can sort of like use that, work with it, use some of the access. And other times it's about retreat also, This last documentary that I did, I'm gonna send you a link to it. I was also supported by the Sundance Documentary Fund called Stateless. I mentioned it earlier about Dominicans of Haitian descent. And the anti-Black hatred that they suffer in the Dominican Republic. There are ways that I connected to it as being a woman of Haitian ancestry, being a migrant to the United States as well, and the issues that we faced as a family. But there's another element of it that I can't relate to, right? But there was also an element where I was there and recognized my privilege there, and actually sort of spent time with the ultra-nationalist wing of the right-wing movement there, that is the anti-Haitian movement. And I kind of leaned into my own privilege of perception to not just better understand, but have that voice in the film through the access that I was able to have. So there could be a larger understanding of exactly what was at stake and what people like, the participants that I was working with were actually facing on a day-to-day basis. So to do that, I actually sort of went a little bit clandestine. I went incognito, I hid my Haitian heritage, and people didn't believe I'm Haitian anyway. So I just kind of did not mention it, and was privy to conversations that were very toxic for me. It was very painful. It was very painful, very, very painful. I mean, I would spend 2 days with this particular participant, and I would spend half a day, crying the next time when I was alone in my hotel room. But I felt that it was a necessary process to include that voice in a way that kept them human also, because, these could be my family members, these could be my neighbors. And making sure that that's represented. And I think that is a place where I really leaned into my own discomfort and not, yeah. So that's just an example of what I try to do in certain spaces. But it's a constant, again, self-awareness and being present and going up against what we have internalized from the centuries that have been passed on to us.
So important. Thank you, Michèle.
Yeah, I mean, I think Michèle, I don't have that much to add to that, but I think one of the things that I try to do in my work is to be extremely inclusive and make sure that all of the participants and everybody involved in the process know that it's not, it's not a process that ends once the project ends, that there's a sense that there's kind of a continued conversation that happens around the project. So I try to really kind of create these environments where where also not only is there kind of a continued conversation, but also we democratize, we have people from different kind of backgrounds that are able to connect with each other that otherwise may not connect with each other. So, for example, a local from Mexico that, lives in one of these towns could somehow also connect with, somebody in New York, for example, that is part of the film. So I try to create these environments. And I have an organization called Imagine Science, which we organize a film festival in New York. I live in New York. I'm just in exile right now in Madrid, but and that environment is also trying. We have this term called Science New Wave, which is this idea that we want to break the barriers between disciplines. So we want scientists, artists, educators, healers, all of these people to come together in these spaces. And I oftentimes, you were mentioning Justice for My Sister, but the ability of having a framework and an organization definitely helps sometimes to gather people together. So my organization, Imagine Science, has helped me make the films that I do and also curate films and bring people together. So those are, for me, it's very important that people understand that it's not, that I'm not just kind of exploiting them, but that there's again an investment and there's a conversation that will happen around the projects that we make together. So
one thing I do want to say, I forgot that I to mention is, one of the first steps is to acknowledge our own baggage and point of view that we bring to the process. For me, and to acknowledge it and even have frank conversations about the power of dynamics that exist in the process that we're going through together. I think that's really, really crucial to sort of even establishing the bonds of trust. And I always usually gravitate, because the work that I do is very personal. There is definitely something personal at stake in the story as well, that I feel, again, lends a rootedness to it. But I think that it's really important for us to acknowledge the baggage that we come with and to be self-aware of that, because I have seen situations where storytellers, there's not even a conscious awareness of the baggage that we bring into the process. And I think that it's got to make for a better story to be aware of it and to understand how it plays out in the space and to own it, really, to own it.
Yeah, I think that's so crucial. The being able to own the stories that we've told ourselves and that we've internalized, and also to own up to our own privileges in whatever form that comes. I think that's just so important to really have that transparency, build from that foundation of trust, and it's a way, like you said, to kind of ensure that we do have that intimacy with ourselves, because oftentimes how colonization and the legacy of colonization has set up is for us to be dishonest with ourselves. And for us to not be able to own up to those privileges or to those stories or that baggage in order to perpetuate it, And so I think that's the beauty of what art gives us, is that ability to really look deeply at ourselves and really to take inventory and take stock on our own narratives and our access to joy, our access to our memories. I'd like to talk a little bit about the ways that you use your storytelling to access memory. And I know we've already talked about it a little bit, but maybe if you could give some more examples of, like I'm thinking, Alexis, in your feature, the ways that you use sound as a vehicle for accessing memory. I find that that's very much in line with the work that we're doing around trauma-informed storytelling, because the way that you entered that memory was through the soundscape, as opposed to kind of recreating this traumatic flooding scene. You know, you're able to kind of viscerally bring us in a way that's not necessarily triggering, but in a way that gives us that emotional resonance without potentially re-traumatizing the audience. So I'd like, if you could speak a little bit about the decision-making process and making that, and entering us into that memory.
But I think the power of sound is that it for one is it has it has a three-dimensional quality to it, right? So there's something very limiting about the image that I find that sometimes when you lay images over specific memories, it can be very kind of reductionist, because you're, you know, an image, you know, in a way, I'm always very concerned about imposing kind of like the filmmaker's intervention, like me dictating how, you know, I want this specific moment or these specific memories to happen. So sound gives me more of that ability to leave things a little bit more open to interpretation, and have people kind of construct their own imagery around those sounds. So I'm also very interested when I use sound. I don't really use sound effects. I tend to take sounds that are within the scene and I manipulate those sounds. I don't necessarily add sound. So I may slow down a sound, or I may, you know, change the frequency of a sound, but I don't necessarily add, you know, kind of artificial layering into my soundscape. And a lot of the memory, because my films are very much based on my own memories and my dreams. A lot of those moments of dreams are actually things that happened to me, you know. So, for example, being covered with insects, you know, those are things that actually happened to me. So I feel like when we get into memory, especially with characters, those tend to be the most biographical moments. Those tend to be a reflection of me, actually. And as I was mentioning before, I feel like that's the moment where I can creep in and kind of add to the mosaic of what the character is feeling. So, but the other thing I will point out is I feel like it's very important to capture those sounds in the moment, in the present, when you're shooting, because there's a tendency when people are filming to not give sound as much importance and say, oh, it's okay, we'll figure that out afterwards. But I spend hours doing wild sounds and just putting the mic on different elements and recording the vibrations and these types of things, because I know that all of that will then be used in the film, and I don't want to add, you know, from a library, you know, like let's put a sound of, you know, New York City or whatnot. So a lot of my work is driven by sound, and kind of having people imagine through those sounds.
Michèle, a lot of the memories in The Changing Same were really reflected through narratives, through people sharing tidbits of insight that they were able to glean along the way as this memory is unfolding on the community. And so very much in the same way, I felt that it was very much in line with the trauma-informed storytelling framework that we're putting together, in that we're getting this insight, but we're not being shown the mutilization. We're not being, you know, kind of subject to the actual visual of the harm. So just looking at the way that the interviews became like this vehicle for this memory to unfold, I'm curious to know what that decision-making process was, like how you were able to think about it also from in the post, and the way that these kind of stories unfold, and kind of ripple out.
Well, there are a couple of things there. I think when you're talking about memory and immersing oneself in the stories, a couple of things, I guess, that come to mind sort of. One is the research. Like, you know, we have to be sort of bathed in the research, right? Of of the moment, of the events, of the participants we are engaging with, of what we're trying to uncover. We're not going to know everything, but it's really important, I think, that this memorialization is also about just research. And when we talk about research, it's not just, you know, the books or the magazines or the references or videos, but it's the sitting down again and speaking to people of different generations and listening to their stories. And that informs then, it never makes it literally into the film necessarily, but because you've embodied it, you've sort of internalized it by listening or by reading, it comes out. It comes out in the cinematography. It comes out, you know, in the questions that are answered or not answered, like in this specific short film, and then I'll move to the VR piece. In the specific short film, you know, there's a huge question mark about body parts, right? That is about the folklore of that history. Oh, well, folklore is not the right word, but the horror, right? Of what is not said and what is said and what still exists. But we leave that open in the space. But we need to have done the research to even go there with our participants. That couple, the white couple from Mariana that we ended up speaking with, never wanted to talk. They were helpful with us in terms of the research. Again, we spent a lot of time with them by the river on the boat. They're telling us about their interpretation of Claude Neal, what they know about the oral history, certainly from a white perspective, that not everybody reacted the same to what was going on, which was really important, that we don't necessarily have in the books, in the history books. And then ultimately they, you know, agreed to continue and be interviewed for the film. And we ended up in this moment about discussing body parts, that they didn't have to answer anything, that we knew that they're, you know, somewhere in that community, people still have that's the body parts. And so what I mean is, for us to get to that is, there is a whole process of research. And so the same with the virtual reality, although we actually use a lot of music in the virtual reality a piece, and there's music also in the short film, but the virtual reality piece is also about research and about, I mean, the music and thinking about, you know, what influences do we want to integrate and fuse, so that, again, we hit an emotional unconscious where I realize it without necessarily being told, because I too, we talk about ancestors, right? In the past, I too have something that has been internalized in me, that I will understand, you know, a particular tune or how something is necessary without it being literally that, if that makes sense. So we kind of like excavated that to create these moments musically or soundscape wise in the 3D space that allows us to have these subconscious references. And that's part of storytelling too. It's like, how do we hit the subconscious without being didactic, right? Or expositional. And how we do that is for us to get the exposition internalized within us, and how can we express it then in a different way. And so, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but we do that. The research is in every space, so we can reinterpret that in a way for people, you know, to sort of recognize things without even realizing they're recognizing it.
Michèle, I love what you said about embodiment, and it's bringing me back to what we were talking about earlier about being present. But just, I mean, this is an embodied art form, because we are capturing these stories through the human form, right? And through human expression. And so, Michèle, would you like to speak more about that concept of embodiment in the storytelling process? Like how does that correlate between the VR and the short?
Wow, it's, you know, in the same way that we're creating human connections, things are transferred to us in that process of conversation, in the process of trauma that I may not have experienced directly with regards to that, but because this exchange is happening, you know, that energy is sort of kind of coming in me. And I think there's an important aspect of acknowledging that as well. But I don't know if I can speak any more to that than saying that and sort of processing it. Like I say, we're functioning at different levels. Sometimes even when we're expressing or putting on paper or, you know, envisioning, or we're working with a really talented composer, his name is Serpent with Feet, you know, there are levels of communication, I guess. And some of it I can't even necessarily tap into consciously, but it's coming out and it brings that. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah, there's a transferal happening all the time, you know, and even with the community of collaborators that we're working with, you know, yeah.
Yeah, resonance and the feedback loop. I mean, ultimately, our stories are told on a screen, and so we have to be able to have that feedback loop with our audience too.
Yes.
Right, from the story from the screen to the audience as well. And I mean, right now there's a feedback loop here via Zoom, right, between all of us. So Alexis, could you speak to the embodiment piece? And I know that, you know, through this kind of like rewilding theme in your film, there is definitely that presence of that embodiment.
Yeah, I one of the things that comes to mind when I think of embodiment, when I kind of build these characters, is that there are these individual components, and I think a lot about these the kind of the hybrid nature of building kind of, or personifying different characters. So basically this idea that there are specific, I try to diversify that kind of the multiple pieces that make up who a character is. And I do that not only in kind of creating the character, but also in the techniques that I use. So I like kind of this idea that I'm using documentary, fiction, science, spirituality, kind of the macro. I like to kind of have almost like a mosaic, and have as many different types of elements that come together to embody these characters that I do. So I'm very aware of that when I'm filming, and also when I'm editing, is really having that array of different elements, and almost like a puzzle, thinking about, okay, well, if I have these pieces, how do they actually connect to each other? And could there be almost like permutations to them? Could I move them around? And I'm really into this idea of chimeras, like the title of my movie is Son of Monarchs, so interested in chimeras between humans and animals. And actually one of the lines in my film is, one of the friends of the character says, "Can we combine human genes with animal genes?" And then the friend says, why ask me that? And he says, because I want to understand who I am. That's basically the scene that happens in a church in Mexico. And so that in many ways, that kind of symbolizes what I think of when I literally create these chimeric creatures in my films. So yeah, that's kind of my approach to the sense of embodiment.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away anything about Son of Monarchs, but there's like this very visceral process that the lead goes through as kind of part of his metamorphosis, so to speak, where that embodiment is explored in a whole other way.
Right.
And yeah, I thought that was really interesting too.
The film is still available for another, I guess, 15 hours, and then so it has like it's on the second screening right now. So if anybody wants to watch it,
is the next kind of like for next? I'm not sure how they're working. It's 24/7 sort of thing that it's on.
It's the same as any other film. Basically every feature film has one screening, one online premiere, and then the second one is a 24-hour window to watch it. And that started at 7 a.m. this morning.
Oh, okay.
Pacific time. And so right now people have a window in which they're able to watch a few of the films that already premiered. So yeah, if anybody hasn't seen it, I'd love to also hear your feedback. It's been amazing. I mean, it's been very frustrating to be disembodied like in these virtual worlds and getting feedback remotely. But in many ways, I'm getting all of this feedback and creating kind of like the perception of what people are feeling about the film. I had a really interesting like Twitter line, which somebody said like, oh, I watched Son of Monarchs and now I empathize so much with butterflies. So, I love that. I was like, okay, well, that's amazing. Now, if people can feel for butterflies, that made my day.
I love the spoken word piece.
Oh yeah.
About the pain of trees.
Oh yeah.
Or it was like the performance piece, rather. Yeah.
Oh yeah. With the girl, she pretends to be a tree. Yeah. Well, that comes back to what I was mentioning, that we don't feel pain of, so I wanted it to be a performance piece in the film where somebody recreates the pain of a tree. Yeah.
So I want to invite, if any of the audience members would like to unmute themselves, and you can also come on camera if you'd like. We'll leave a little bit of space for at least one audience member to ask any questions. So one of the audience members is asking, is there a way to watch the film sooner than later if she can't see it at Sundance?
Yeah, so a lot of these questions are, even as the filmmaker, speaking of ownership, a lot of these questions we don't know yet in terms of it's probably going to play in festivals or, but there will be other screenings. It's just that we don't know yet exactly where, what's going to happen. A lot of it is based on distribution and the business of film, which is, it is what it is. You have to kind of let them figure out, because we're looking for distributors basically. But the film will be shown in different festivals, and we'll continue. It's going to be in the Berlin market in a few weeks, and then we'll keep you updated. There's a website, sonofmonarchs.com, if you want to keep be updated on where we're going to be next. Hopefully shown in a cinema would be amazing.
So for our short film, it's actually available on PBS's POV Shorts platform. It was broadcast as part of their season last year. And for the VR project, there is that tethered headset experience you can have if you go to the gallery at Sundance. There is a walkthrough available. We're going to have a 360 video, which makes it more accessible for folks after Sundance, because we've been rushing to the finish line for this one, for the actual experience. And for those people who are local in New York, there is a limited time that it's going to be available at Onyx, which is New Ink, which is actually by appointment and for social distancing and all of that. Right now, it's a press that is being a local press that is based in New York. This has access, but I think they're going to leave it on as part of their exhibit for a little longer for the VR piece. The piece Stateless that I refer to will be part of the POV season this coming June. And
exciting.
It's part of, yeah. So
that's awesome.
Sounds amazing, yeah.
Looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
So we have space for one more audience member question, if anybody wants to come onto the mic and
I'm going to just
ask a question of the panelists.
People are asking for websites. I'll just write it. Our website is RADA, R-A-D-A, studio.org. And you can, sign up for our newsletter and also find out more about our films, our projects.
Awesome.
I wanted to say, raise my hand.
Do we have a question? Oh, Natalie.
Hi, team. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I really didn't have a question, but I just wanted to thank you guys because I'm so grateful for all of your words and all your comments and your shared experiences. And I really can't wait to watch your films. I'm just gonna really find them right after. But this was very informative and learning about your own processes. And I think also the difficulties of the trauma. And I do have a question. I wanted to know, you guys, how you find balance, and what's something that that you go to. You know, I always feel like when you're healing, you have your tools, and if you have something that you go to, that it's balancing for you when you are working with trauma and artistry and creativity.
I mean, my answer is pretty simple. I'm obsessed with microscopes. So whenever I'm not feeling well, or when I'm going through, I look at things through the microscope. So that's my healing process. I have like 20 microscopes at home, and I love taking also any object and looking at it under the microscope. So I know that's an odd way of dealing with trauma, but or healing. But that's kind of like my refuge.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
I think for me, when I can, dancing is my passion.
Oh, yes.
In the kitchen, anywhere, just turn it up.
Natalie's a dancer, so
yeah.
that was the perfect answer. This girl is also part of my healing. This is Oma.
Amazing.
And just brings me so much joy. I think for me also finding moments of stillness and just the practice of softening and being able to like drop my shoulders, release my forehead, like, you know, relax my eyebrows, relax my inner ear, you know, just finding moments throughout the day to do that, but also having a meditation practice, and then giving myself the space to do free write as often as I can, ideally every day, but it's not every day that I'm able to do it, but it's a really great practice just to trust the movement of my hand, that whatever will come out will help me with my own processing of whatever it is that I need to move through. So thank you for that question.
For sharing.
We are beautifully coming to a close. And so I just want to close out this conversation by once again thanking all of you, honoring all of the ancestors and stewards of the land that you represent, and that have accompanied us on this conversation as well. And thanking Sundance Film Festival for connecting us and providing a platform to work, and also to thank Amber Espinosa Jones for helping to coordinate, and to Julissa Villatoro for being a wonderful tech support, and just so grateful to all of you for bringing your energy to this space. And welcome to Chris Hastings, our board member who's here. I'm so happy to have you. It's always good to have support from our leadership team. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Definitely check out the Changing Same and Son of Monarchs. And lovely to make your acquaintance, Alexis. So good to connect with you, Michèle. It's always good to chat.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Really looking forward to seeing everybody's next films.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
And we'll be here on behalf of Justice for My Sister if anybody wants